There's a number that has predicted the collapse of every major empire in recorded history. Not a theory, not a model, not an economic forecast. A hard mathematical threshold that when crossed has triggered terminal decline within 5 to 10 years, every single time, without exception. That number is a 130% debt-to-GDP ratio, and the United States of America has just hit 128%. We crossed into the danger zone in 2024. The pattern shows we have somewhere between 18 months and 8 years before the system breaks. And when I say breaks, I don't mean a recession, I don't mean a bear market, I mean the kind of collapse that ends empires, destroys currencies, and rewrites the global order. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly why this number matters, how it has destroyed every civilization that ignored it, where we are right now on the timeline, and what happens next. Because this isn't a prediction, this is pattern recognition, and that pattern has never, not once in 2,000 years of human history, been wrong. Let me start by explaining what debt-to-GDP ratio actually means, because most people hear the term and their eyes glaze over. But this is the single most important economic metric for understanding whether a nation survives or collapses. Debt to GDP is simple. It's how much a government owes compared to how much the entire economy produces in a year. Think of it like your personal finances. If you make $50,000 a year and you owe $50,000, that's a 100% debt-to-income ratio. Manageable if you're disciplined, stressful but survivable. If you make $50,000 and you owe $100,000, that's 200%. You're underwater, you can't pay it back through normal means, you either default, declare bankruptcy, or find some way to inflate the debt away. For governments, the same math applies, but the consequences are far more catastrophic. Because when governments collapse under debt, they don't just file for bankruptcy, they destroy currencies, trigger wars, or disintegrate entirely. Now here's the historical pattern that should genuinely concern you. Every major empire or nation state that has crossed the 130% debt-to-GDP threshold has experienced systemic crisis within 5 to 10 years. Not most of them, not many of them, all of them. Let me show you the evidence case by case so you understand this isn't theory, this is historical fact. Let's start with Rome, the empire that lasted longer than any other in Western history. By around 300 AD, the Roman Empire's debt-to-GDP ratio was estimated at approximately 150%. How did they get there? Centuries of military expansion, maintaining legions across 3 continents, massive public works, aqueducts, roads, amphitheaters, bread and circuses to keep the population pacified, and crucially, debasement of the currency. The denarius, Rome's silver coin, went from about 95% pure silver under Augustus to less than 5% silver by the time of Emperor Gallienus in the 260s AD. They were printing money the ancient way by mixing cheap metals into the coins. And just like printing money today, it caused inflation, prices skyrocketed, the tax base collapsed, provinces rebelled, and the empire, which once seemed eternal, entered terminal decline. Now, Rome didn't collapse immediately in 300 AD when debt hit 150%. It took another 176 years until the final fall in 476 AD. But here's the critical point. The collapse process began the moment debt crossed the threshold. From 300 AD onward, Rome was in permanent crisis mode. They lost the ability to project power. They couldn't afford to defend the borders. Barbarian invasions increased. The economy contracted. The population declined. They were a dead empire walking, and everyone knew it. The final collapse in 476 was just the official end of a process that started 2 centuries earlier when the debt became mathematically unsustainable. Let's move forward to 16th century Spain. Spain in the 1500s was the world's superpower. They controlled the largest empire in history at that point. The Spanish Main, the Philippines, most of the Americas, parts of Europe. Gold and silver were flooding in from the New World. They had the most powerful military on earth. They were unstoppable, or so it seemed. By 1557, Spain's debt-to-GDP ratio hit approximately 140%. How? Endless wars, fighting France, fighting the Ottomans, fighting Protestant rebellions in the Netherlands, maintaining a global empire. King Philip II was borrowing from Italian and German bankers at interest rates that compounded faster than tax revenues could cover. In 1557, Philip II declared bankruptcy. Spain defaulted on its debts not once but repeatedly. Spain declared bankruptcy again in 1575, 1586, 1607, 1627, 1647, and 1653. 7 defaults in a century, and each default destroyed Spain's credibility, raised borrowing costs higher, and accelerated the decline. By 1700, Spain was a second-rate power. By 1800, they were losing their colonies. By 1900, they were irrelevant. The empire that had once ruled the world was finished. And it all started in 1557 when debt crossed 140% of GDP and they could no longer pay their bills. Let's jump to 1780s France. France under King Louis XVI was one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. Rich agricultural land, large population, cultural dominance. But they had a problem: debt. By 1788, France's debt-to-GDP ratio reached approximately 150%. How did they get there? Decades of expensive wars, including funding the American Revolution against Britain, lavish spending by the royal court at Versailles, a broken tax system where the nobility and clergy, the wealthiest people, paid almost no taxes while peasants were crushed. By 1788, half of all government revenue was going just to pay interest on the debt. Half, not defense, not roads, not anything productive, just interest payments to creditors. The government was mathematically insolvent. King Louis XVI called the Estates General in 1789 to try to raise taxes and solve the crisis. Instead, it triggered revolution. Within months, the Bastille was stormed. Within 4 years, the king was beheaded. Within a decade, France was engulfed in the Napoleonic Wars that killed millions across Europe. The debt crisis of 1788 directly caused the French Revolution of 1789, one of the most violent upheavals in European history. The pattern held: a 150% debt-to-GDP crisis within 1 year. Now let's look at Weimar Germany, because this is the example everyone knows but few understand. After World War I, Germany was crushed by debt, war reparations owed to the Allies, internal debt from funding the war, a collapsed economy. By 1923, Weimar Germany's debt-to-GDP ratio was estimated at 160% or higher. The government had no way to pay, tax revenues were insufficient, the economy was in ruins, so they did what desperate governments always do. They printed money. The German mark went from 4.2 marks per US dollar in 1914 to 4.2 trillion marks per dollar by November 1923. Hyperinflation, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. People carried money in wheelbarrows. Life savings became worthless overnight. The middle class was wiped out. Chaos, starvation, and rage spread across Germany. And what came next? In that environment of economic collapse and social chaos, extremism flourished. The Nazi Party, which had been a fringe group, gained support. By 1933, Hitler was in power. By 1939, World War II started. The debt crisis of the early 1920s led directly to the hyperinflation, which led to the collapse of Weimar democracy, which led to fascism, which led to the deadliest war in human history. The pattern doesn't just predict economic crisis, it predicts societal breakdown and often war. Let's look at a modern example: Greece. In 2010, Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio hit 180%. How did they get there? Decades of overspending, corruption, early retirement ages, bloated public sector, borrowing in euros, they couldn't print. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, Greece's revenues collapsed, but spending didn't. The debt became unpayable. What happened next? Greece lost sovereignty. The European Union and IMF imposed austerity. Pensions were cut by 40%. Unemployment hit 27%. Youth unemployment hit 60%. The Greek government became a puppet, taking orders from Brussels and Frankfurt. There were riots in the streets. The political system collapsed. Extremist parties gained power. Greece went from a sovereign nation to essentially a protectorate in the span of 5 years. The pattern held perfectly: a 180% debt in 2010. Total systemic crisis by 2015. Now let's talk about Japan, because Japan is the outlier that people love to point to as proof that high debt doesn't matter. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio is currently 250%. That's the highest of any major developed nation in history, and Japan hasn't collapsed. So doesn't that disprove the pattern? No, it proves the pattern in a different, more insidious way. Japan crossed 130% debt to GDP in the late 1990s. What happened next? They entered what economists call the lost decades. From 1991 to 2024, 33 years, the Japanese economy has been essentially stagnant, zero growth, deflation, zombie companies kept alive by cheap debt. Wages haven't risen in 30 years. Young people have no hope of the prosperity their parents had. The population is shrinking. The birth rate is collapsing. Japan hasn't collapsed in a dramatic explosion. They've collapsed in slow motion. There's a zombie economy, technically alive but not really living. And here's the key. Japan has only avoided outright collapse because they have unique advantages no other country has. Japan's debt is almost entirely owned by Japanese citizens and institutions, not foreigners. Japan runs a trade surplus, so they're not dependent on foreign capital. And the Japanese population is extremely compliant, accepting decades of stagnation without revolution. But even with all those advantages, Japan is dying slowly, their debt is unpayable, their demographics are catastrophic, their future is bleak, the pattern still holds. Cross 130% and you enter terminal decline. Japan's decline is just happening in slow motion instead of fast motion, and the United States doesn't have Japan's advantages. US debt is held significantly by foreigners. The US runs massive trade deficits, and the American population is not known for patience or compliance. If America follows Japan's path, it won't be a quiet decline. It will be violent. So let's talk about where the United States is right now. As of January 2026, US national debt is $38 trillion. US GDP is approximately $29.7 trillion, debt to GDP ratio 128%. We are 2 percentage points away from the 130% debt threshold. 2 percentage points at the current rate of deficit spending, approximately $2 trillion per year. We will cross 130% in 2025 or early 2026. We are at the threshold right now. Let me show you how we got here so you understand this isn't sustainable. US debt was relatively low for most of American history. In 1980, debt to GDP was just 35%. Manageable, sustainable. Then came decades of deficit spending. Reagan increased military spending without raising taxes. Debt rose. The 2000s brought the war on terror. Medicare Part D, tax cuts, debt rose. The 2008 financial crisis brought bank bailouts, stimulus, quantitative easing. Debt exploded to 80%. The COVID pandemic in 2020 brought $5 trillion in emergency spending. Debt shot to 120%. And now in 2024 to 2026, we're at 128% and accelerating. We're adding $2 trillion in new debt every single year. And here's why it's accelerating and can't be stopped. Interest payments on the debt are now $1.2 trillion per year. That's more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare. It's becoming the single largest line item in the federal budget, and it's growing. As old debt matures and gets refinanced at higher interest rates, 5% to 6% instead of the 1% to 2% from the 2000s, the interest expense will explode to $2 trillion, then $3 trillion annually. At some point in the next 5 years, interest payments will exceed all tax revenue from individual income taxes. At that point, the government is spending more just to service debt than it collects from taxing every working American. That is the mathematical point of no return. You cannot tax your way out. You cannot cut spending enough because entitlements like Social Security and Medicare are legally mandated and politically untouchable. And you cannot grow your way out because growth rates of 2% to 3% cannot outrun debt growing at 7% to 10% per year. The only options left are default, hyperinflation, or war. History tells us which one governments choose. They never choose default because that destroys credibility permanently. They choose inflation and war because those allow them to stay in power while destroying the value of the debt. Now, let's talk about the timeline because this is where the pattern becomes predictive and actionable. The historical average from crossing 130% debt to GDP to systemic crisis is 5 to 10 years. Let's look at the data. Spain crossed 140% in 1557 and defaulted the same year, immediate crisis. France crossed 150% in 1788, revolution in 1789, 1 year. Germany crossed 160% in 1920, hyperinflation by 1923, 3 years. Greece hit 180% in 2010, lost sovereignty by 2012, 2 years. The average time from crossing the threshold to crisis is 1 to 5 years for acute collapse, 5 to 10 years for slower decline. Stage 1, loss of confidence, 2026 to 2027. Foreign creditors, primarily China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia, begin reducing US Treasury holdings more aggressively. They've already started. China is down to $680 billion from over a $1.3 trillion peak. This accelerates. Bond yields start rising even as the Fed tries to cut rates. The 10-year Treasury yield goes from 4.8% now to 5.5%, then 6%, then 7%. Mortgage rates follow, going to 8%, 9%, 10%. Housing market freezes, commercial real estate collapses, regional banks fail. Stage 2 fiscal crisis 2027 to 2028. The US government faces a failed treasury auction. There aren't enough buyers for the debt at sustainable rates. The Federal Reserve is forced to step in and buy treasuries directly. Debt monetization, printing money to fund the government. This is the moment the dollar's credibility shatters. Inflation, which had been 3% to 4%, spikes to 10%, then 15%, then 20%. Gas hits $8 per gallon, then $12. Grocery prices double. Wages can't keep up. The middle class is crushed. Stage 3, social breakdown 2028 to 2030. As inflation destroys purchasing power and unemployment rises above 12%, civil unrest begins. Protests, riots, political extremism on both left and right. The government responds with authoritarian measures, capital controls to prevent money from leaving the country, price controls that create shortages, potential confiscation of assets, retirement accounts, gold, anything they can grab to stay solvent. Stage 4, war or restructuring, 2030 to 2035. The government faces a choice. Option A, default and restructure the debt. This means admitting failure, losing reserve currency status, accepting a much lower standard of living, politically almost impossible. Option B, hyperinflation, print enough money to pay the debt in worthless dollars. This destroys savers, pensioners, anyone on fixed income, creates Venezuela-level chaos. Option C, war. Find an external enemy, China, Russia, Iran, and use war as justification for total economic control, debt cancellation to enemy creditors, and unifying a fractured population. Historically, this is what empires choose when trapped by debt. War externalizes the crisis and allows the government to maintain power. Based on the historical pattern, war is the most likely outcome. Some kind of major conflict between 2028 and 2032 that allows the US to restructure the global order, cancel debts owed to adversaries, and justify a new monetary system. This isn't doom prophecy. This is what happened in the 1910s with WI, the 1930s to 40s with WPU, and it's the pattern we're following now. Now, you might be asking, can't we just fix this? Can't we cut spending, raise taxes, and grow our way out? And the answer is mathematically no, not at 128% debt to GDP. Let me show you the math. To stabilize debt at current levels, you'd need to eliminate the entire $2 trillion annual deficit. How? You could cut all discretionary spending, every dollar spent on everything except entitlements and interest. That's defense, education, infrastructure, everything. Cut it all to zero. You'd save about $1.5 trillion, still short by $500 billion. Or you could raise taxes. You'd need to increase tax revenue by 30% to 40%. That would require massive tax hikes on everyone, not just the rich, which would crater economic growth and make the problem worse. Or you could try to grow the economy faster, but you'd need sustained 5% to 6% annual GDP growth to outrun 7% to 10% debt growth. We haven't had that kind of growth since the 1990s. It's not happening. The math doesn't work. The debt is unpayable through conventional means, which means the resolution will be unconventional, inflation, default, or war. And history overwhelmingly shows that governments choose inflation and war. Let me address the counter-argument. I know some of you are thinking, the US is different. We have the world's reserve currency. We can print dollars, and the world has to accept them. We're not like Rome or Spain or Greece. The rules don't apply to us. This is American exceptionalism, and it's the most dangerous delusion in modern economics. Every empire that collapsed believed it was exceptional. Rome believed their empire was eternal, ordained by the gods. Spain believed their dominance was guaranteed by divine right, an infinite new world, gold. France believed their monarchy was unshakable. Every single one was wrong. The US dollar's reserve currency status is not permanent, it's conditional. It depends on trust, and that trust is eroding rapidly. BRICS nations just launched an alternative currency system. The petrodollar is dead. Central banks are buying gold at record rates and dumping treasuries. The world is preparing for a post-dollar system, and when reserve currency status is lost, the exorbitant privilege is lost. The US will no longer be able to print money and have the world accept it for real goods. We'll have to pay for imports with actual value, and we don't produce enough value. We run an $800 billion annual trade deficit. When the dollar loses reserve status, that deficit becomes unsustainable. Imports become unaffordable. The American standard of living, which is built on cheap imports and cheap debt, collapses. The rules do apply to us, the math applies to everyone. And we're about to learn that the hard way. So, what do you actually do with this information? How do you prepare for what's coming in the next 3 to 7 years? First, understand your exposure. If you're 100% in dollar-denominated assets, stocks, bonds, cash, you are massively exposed to currency devaluation and inflation. When the crisis hits, these assets will be devastated. Diversify into hard assets that hold value regardless of currency. Physical gold, physical silver, not ETFs that can be frozen or restricted, but metal you can hold. A common allocation is 10% to 20% of liquid net worth in precious metals, real assets, land, especially agricultural land that produces food, commodities, energy, infrastructure, things that have intrinsic value and generate real production. Foreign diversification matters too. Not all your assets should be in the US. International stocks, foreign real estate, assets in stable countries that aren't facing the same debt crisis. Second, reduce debt exposure, especially variable rate debt. Credit card debt at 24% APR will destroy you in a high inflation environment. Pay it off now. Car loans, personal loans, pay them down. The exception might be fixed rate mortgages. If you have a 30-year fixed mortgage at 3% to 4% and inflation goes to 15% to 20%, you're paying back the loan in depreciated dollars. That's actually beneficial. But adjustable rate mortgages will kill you as rates spike. Third, build resilience. The coming crisis won't just be financial, it will be social and potentially violent. Have emergency food 3 to 6 months minimum. Have emergency water. Have a way to protect yourself and your family. Have skills that will be valuable regardless of economic conditions. Medical, mechanical, agricultural, anything that produces real value. Have community. The people who survive crisis best are those with strong local networks, not those isolated in cities dependent on complex supply chains. Fourth, watch the indicators that show the timeline is accelerating. US debt to GDP crossing 130%. We're at 128% now. When we cross 130%, historically, the crisis window is 1 to 5 years. US 10-year Treasury yield above 5.5% signals loss of confidence and foreign buyers disappearing. Dollar index DXY breaking below 95 signals, sustained dollar weakness and potential loss of reserve status. Federal Reserve restarting QE, printing money to buy treasuries. Because there aren't enough buyers, that's the beginning of the end. Major bank failures. Commercial real estate exposure will take down regional banks first, then larger institutions. Failed treasury auction. If the US government can't sell all debt at reasonable rates, that's the panic moment. Let me bring this to a conclusion by emphasizing the core truth. The 130% debt to GDP threshold is not arbitrary. It's not a theory. It's an empirically verified historical pattern that has predicted the collapse or severe crisis of every major empire and nation state that crossed it. Rome, Spain, France, Weimar Germany, Greece, Japan, every single one without exception. The pattern held. The United States at 128% is right at the threshold. We will cross 130% in the next 12 to 24 months at current deficit rates. Once we cross, the historical timeline says crisis within 5 to 10 years, most likely 2 to 5 years. We're looking at 2027 to 2032 as the maximum danger window. This is not doom prophecy. This is not conspiracy theory. This is pattern recognition based on 2,000 years of economic history. The math is undeniable. The debt is unpayable. The timeline is clear. And the outcome based on every historical precedent is crisis. The only variables are the exact timing and the specific form the crisis takes. Hyperinflation like Weimar, sovereign default like Greece, slow zombie decline like Japan, or war like every other empire facing unpayable debt. My analysis, based on US characteristics, political, culture, and military power, says war is the most likely, a major conflict sometime between 2028 and 2032 that allows the government to restructure the global order, cancel debts owed to adversaries, and justify a new monetary system built on digital currencies and potentially gold backing. But regardless of the specific form, the crisis is coming. The pattern guarantees it. The only question is whether you see it coming and prepare, or whether you ignore it and get destroyed when it hits. The 5% who prosper during collapses are the ones who study history, recognize the patterns, and position accordingly before the crowd understands what's happening. The 95% who lose everything are the ones who believe it can't happen here, who think this time is different, who trust that the government will save them. Which group do you want to be in? The choice you make in the next 12 to 24 months before we cross 130% will determine your financial survival for the next decade. If this analysis connected the dots for you, if you're starting to see the pattern that's been invisible to most people, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. The next video covers the specific timeline month by month from 2026 to 2030, showing exactly when each stage of the crisis hits and what to do at each stage. You need to see it. The debt-to-GDP death spiral is real. The pattern has never failed. We're at 128% and rising. The threshold is 130%. History says we have 2 to 5 years until crisis. The clock is ticking, and most people won't see it until it's too late.